So it's an enormous pleasure to host Zadie on this occasion. My name's Pete Boller. I'm the Professor of Cultural History and Aesthetics here in Cambridge. I expect some of you who've joined us know who I am, perhaps not everyone. I was Director of Studies and I've been a Fellow and Director of Studies in King's since 1996, so a long time. 1986, excuse me, a long time. But I admitted Zadie to her undergraduate degree and taught her when she was here. And we're going to start with just a little bit of conversation about what King's was like. When you came up, Zadie, everyone who's joined us now for this webinar will have their own version of King's. It doesn't stay the same. I've been in the college for a long time now. It's certainly the case that generations differ and the outside world differs. When you came up, it was in the early 1990s, if I remember. Is that right?
94.
94.
Yeah.
So you were, I guess you were not quite in the full force of the rave generation, but sort of at the close of it. That'd be about right?
I mean, I did my fair share. There was a lot of partying. Yeah, I remember that. We had King Cellars still. Do you do that anymore? No.
It's gone through many manifestations, but at the moment it's full of scaffolding holding up the roof because there's lots of work going on in the Keynes building. But it's been renamed a number of times. Current generations know it as the bunker. In my generation, it was called the late night bar. I don't know what it was called when you were an undergraduate.
We used to have, weekly mini raves down there. Yeah, King Cellars it was then.
Right. And apart from partying, what else did you spend your time doing? A little bit of work. I was involved in that for a time.
I mean, I remember being very nervous coming up. It was so out of my wheelhouse, out of my experience. I'd read a lot about it, but I'd read, my knowledge about it was almost all, Bloomsbury dated. So I don't know what I was expecting, but of course it wasn't Bloomsbury or whatever I thought it was going to be. I mean, there were women there for starters. So my idea of it was antique in the beginning. I desperately wanted to learn things. That was it really.
Did you put yourself into the various dramatic things and clubs and that kind of stuff? Or
I participated in nothing, just nothing apart from reading, writing essays and drinking. I had no external interest of any kind. I did try in the first few weeks because I'd sing and I wanted to be in musicals. So I went for an audition for Guys and Dolls, and to play Adelaide, which is a part I know inside out, And I walked in and it was a nice kind of Hugh Grant-y looking boy who was auditioning me. And I opened my mouth and he said, oh no. And I realized he was, they were looking for a blonde and that was that. And my response to that kind of thing was just, okay, fine. I just had no interest from then on. So I just stayed in the library for the rest of the 3 years and the bar, library and the bar.
Were you writing the whole time or was that something which came on a little into your career in Cambridge? I mean, creative writing.
No, I mean, I was never writing creatively. I didn't, I wanted to be an academic, and I also didn't have any thought of King's as a place that was open to that kind of writing. I mean, I knew that writers had come through it, obviously, many great writers actually, but I thought of that as playtime. I didn't take. Even though I was studying writers, I thought of them as lesser, that's how I thought of them. I thought of them as like inspired idiots who it was our job to analyze and bring to full meaning because they weren't capable of doing it by themselves. That's how I thought of creative writers, basically. I admired them in the way children admire stories, but I wanted to think about things. I didn't think that creative writing was about thinking. It was a stupid opposition in my mind, but that's how it was.
And your immediate group of friends, the people who I know you still see to this day,
right?
They were from quite disparate subjects, weren't they? You weren't very focused on the English group itself.
I never really met quote unquote intellectuals. I was excited by that idea, and a lot of we were doing theory in your class, and that was spread across the college at that time, particularly in anthropology and history. And to me, that's where people were thinking really interestingly. And I only realized after I left, because I was so enmeshed in your course. Like when I talked to my husband or other people across the university, they were doing English literature in a completely different way, in a way that I might have thought then as kind of romantic or old-fashioned. So it was in the other departments where I found people thinking about structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction. There wasn't a lot of that in the English department. There was in King's, but not. If you went to the lectures, there was a kind of disconnect between what I was becoming interested in and what was being taught.
And you became very friendly with Josh Appininese, who has become a filmmaker, a pretty filmmaker. Was film ever something that you thought a direction you might go in?
I don't have any taste officially. I don't have any. I enjoy cinema, but I mean, Josh, his whole attempt in 3 years was to educate me about film. I have really bad taste in films. I like movies. He likes cinema, and for me, there's a kind of disconnect there. So I was always aware of not having interesting ideas about a cinema, even though I love it. So I never really thought about it because to me it's something that requires a greater visual sense than I have. The kind of films I liked, as he often would say, were plays with a camera put in the front. Language is what matters to me, a little monomaniacal on that front.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit later about the visual, I hope, if we manage the timings right on this. So let's park that for the moment. I wonder if you could say something about more recent life now. So here I have in mind, perhaps you elaborating a little on a few of the throwaway sentences which are in the new book of 6 essays, which is called Intimations, which has just been published, and from which you're going to read a couple of essays as we go along. There are moments where you give a kind of aperture or a kind of very, very small opening onto what it's like being a writer, your life as a writer. I mean, obviously, if I asked another writer what it was like being a writer, they'd give me a very different answer. But how would you characterize your life as a writer? I mean, you taught writing at NYU for 10 years. Do you see that as very closely connected to the, as it were, the day job, the real writing that you do as an incredibly acclaimed novelist?
I mean, I know a lot of writers, and they're on a spectrum. I know I'm on the more academic end of that spectrum. So, money aside, my daily life is structured almost identically as it was in King's. Wake up, do some form of exercise, go to the library, or to the study, or to any room with a desk, work for as many hours as I can get away with. Now it's different with kids, obviously. Then drink, then movie, then bed. And on it goes for 25 years. So teaching for me is an extension of it. I mean, the way I do it, I am in a creative writing department, but from the start, for 1 year I tried to teach creative writing in the way that it's expected to be taught in America, and it was impossible for me. It requires interpersonal skills I don't have, in terms of dealing with the idea that a group of people are putting their most intimate selves in front of you in a vulnerable way. I honestly don't think of writing like that. I understand other people do, but it was a disconnect. I could not do for them what they wanted, what I thought was useful, which is editing sentences. They wanted something much broader, personal, psychological. That I couldn't do. So I went back to teaching, English as far as I understand it, to students who I know want to write. So the difference for me, the only part of my English degree that was, not lacking but difficult for someone who wanted to write creatively, was the great gap between this kind of theoretical thought and what writing actually involves. So now that I'm teaching, what I try to do is read novels as a writer. So the perspective I have on them, though perhaps academic in some senses, is also about the lived experience of writing, and that's the kind of class I try and teach.
And I remember you telling me early on when you moved to NYU that you were getting all of your students to basically read. The writing bit really meant that you had to learn how to read. You had to be a good reader. So
Yeah,
very
they
much an
don't do
emphasis
any
on
creative writing with me. I don't read. I mean, I have to read sometimes the MFA students' novels, but my undergraduates don't write fiction or poetry. They write essays on novels. And
sounds
it's a
like
prejudice of
sounds
mine,
like
but that's
a
how I'm meant to
Cambridge
write.
BA.
Say again?
Sounds like a Cambridge BA.
Yeah, they do. It's modeled exactly the way I was taught. I make them read, 14 books in 14 weeks, which is not normal in America ever. And they write an essay every week, and that's the practice. Yeah.
And there's one sentence in the new book where you point out that you're not very comfortable with the use of this word creative as it's attached to writing. Tell us a little bit about that.
I just it's not meaningful to me. I When I'm writing, I'm organizing ideas. That's what it feels like to me. I understand the bit people mean, the inspiration part. In my case, the kind of writing I do, that I suppose that's voices. A more romantic writer might talk about hearing voices, writing them down. I suppose when it's going well, something like that is happening. But I don't know what the use of talking about it that way is for anyone else. To say, I sit down and I hear these voices, and there are obviously logical reasons why I hear voices. I keep my ear out. I've lived in a place with many people talking in many different ways. I'm interested in it. I like to imitate it. I just, for me, the real exercise of writing is organizational. It's like an enormous mass of information, feeling, and it has to be something has to be carved out, and that carving out creative is a small part of it for sure, but the major work of a novel is much more laborious than some momentary inspiration.
It's very interesting what you're saying. There's another phrase that you use in the same essay in the new book, where you say perhaps the department that you teach in NYU would best be named the Controlling Experience Department. That sounds rather scary, but Controlling Experience Department. Could you say a bit more about that?
If you know enough writers, that's just that's the truth. I'm reading at the moment an 800-page biography of Philip Roth, and what's so striking in all the chaos of his life and his personal life and his disastrous uh, intimate relations with pretty much everybody is that the reason he wrote every day towards the end and did nothing else is because that was where he could control things. You can't control people. You can't control human relations. You can't control your wife or husband, your children, your friends, your country, your situation, but you can control what's on the page. And the most of the writers I know are control freaks. And there are a lot of habits they have, having the same lunch every day, going to the same place, that perhaps seems romantic to somebody else, but seems to me a way of controlling the area. They like things to be under their control. But it's a psychologically perverse thing to do, of course, because when you're writing, you have all this control on the page. But one of the things that was important to me in Kings, one of the perhaps the greatest lessons, is the knowledge that once the text is written, you're out of the picture. Then the reader takes over, and the reader has full rights and power over this selection of words on the page. So it's a strange habit for a control freak because it involves the relinquishing of the thing that you took such care over.
So to maybe bring this section of our conversation to a pause, just to sum up something which occurs to me in what you've been saying, there's a huge stress here on the discipline that's required in your life. Not only presumably organizing family life with two young children and all of the discipline that takes for a mother, parent, and so on, but the discipline of being a writer. There's a huge emphasis in what you're saying about that. And it strikes me that that's something that, I don't know whether you'd agree with me, but that's something that you've learned post-university. I don't remember you being a very disciplined student.
I remember being chaotic. You know, I think if I didn't fail my part ones, I got very close. I if I came, you know, my emotional life, intimate life, love affairs, friendships, uh, was so dominant in my mind. You know, that if something went wrong in there, everything else fell apart. I was certainly dramatic. I probably still am. Um, but obsessive always, you know. Sometimes the time would not be well balanced if I found a book. I like remember doing Middlemarch. You know, that would take a huge section of my life. I'd be in the library all night, reading about it, thinking about it, and having to a kind of completist thing. So if you'd set something to read, I had to read not only that thing but the secondary text and the you know I had to read everything before I felt confident. A lot of what became discipline was insecurity. You know, I just never ever assumed that I knew anything. I always assumed that everybody else was better educated, had gone to better schools, etc., etc. That anxiety, I believe the young people call it imposter syndrome now, was for me uh, highly useful because I never took anything for granted. It was a kind of engine, you know, behind me all the time. Not that I think people should have to feel that sense of imposterdom, but I recognize in myself uh, a desire to prove something constantly, which ended up being looking a lot like discipline.
Okay, so let's move to our first reading. So I chose this. I made this suggestion to Zadie. I chose this because in the new book, there are moments when one gets a very strong sense of what it's been like for you dealing with this extraordinary public health crisis that we're in. And one of the essays is called "Something to Do," and it's very much gives a very strong sense of how you have dealt with this disaster, this crisis that we're in. So let's hear you read this wonderful piece.
Something to do. If you make things, if you're an artist of whatever stripe, at some point you'll be asked, or may ask yourself, why you act, sculpt, paint, whatever. In the writing world, this question never seems to get old. In each generation, a few too many people will feel moved to pen an essay called, inevitably, Why I Write, or Why Write, under which title you'll find a lot of convoluted, more or less self-regarding reasons and explanations. I've contributed to this genre myself. Only a few of them are any good, and none of them, including my own, see fit to mention the surest motivation I know, the one I feel deepest within myself, and which, when all is said and done, stripped away, as it is at the moment, seems to be at the truth of the matter for a lot of people, to wit, it's something to do. I used to stand at podiums or in front of my own students and have that answer on the tip of my tongue, but I knew if I said it aloud, it would be mistaken for a joke, or fake humility, or perhaps plain stupidity. Now I'm gratified to find this most honest of phrases in everybody's mouths all of a sudden, and in answer to almost every question. Why did you bake that banana bread? It was something to do. Why did you make a fort in your living room? Well, it's something to do. Why dress the dog as a cat? Something to do, isn't it? Fills the time. Out of an expanse of time, you carve a little area that nobody asked you to carve, and you do something. But perhaps the difference between the kind of something that I'm used to and this new culture of doing something is the moral anxiety that surrounds it. The something that artists have always done is more usually cordoned off from the rest of society, and by mutual agreement this space is considered a sort of charming but basically useless playpen, in which adults get to behave like children, making up stories and drawing pictures and so on, though at least they provide some form of pleasure to serious people doing actual jobs. The more utilitarian-minded defenders of art justify its existence by insisting upon its potential political efficacy, which is usually overstated. Artists themselves are especially fond of overstating it. But even if you believe in the potential political efficacy of art, as I do, few artists would dare to count on its timeliness. It's a delusional painter who finishes a canvas at 2 o'clock and expects radical societal transformation by 4. Even when artists write manifestos, they are, hopefully, aware that their exigent tone is finally borrowed, only echoing and mimicking the urgency of the guerrilla's demands or the activist's protests, rather than truly enacting it. The people sometimes demand change. They almost never demand art. As a consequence, art stands in a dubious relation to necessity and to time itself. It is something to do, yes, but when it is done, and whether it is done at all, is generally considered a question for artists alone. An attempt to connect the artist's labour with the work of truly labouring people is frequently made, but always strikes me as tenuous, with the fundamental dividing line being this question of the clock. Labour is work done by the clock and paid by it too. Art takes time and divides it up as art sees fit. It is something to do. But the crisis has taken this familiar division between the time of art and the time of work and transformed it. Now there are essential workers who do not need to seek out something to do, whose task is vital and unrelenting, and there are the rest of us, all with a certain amount of time on our hands. Not to mention an economic time bomb, which for many people exploded within the first few weeks, within the first few days. One of the radical political possibilities of our new, revelatory, expansive free time, as many have noted, is that it might create a collective demand to reassess and reconfigure as a society how we protect the rights of those whose work exists only in the present moment, without security or protection against unknown futures, the most obvious unknown future being sick leave. The rest of us have been suddenly confronted with the perennial problem of artists, time and what to do with it. What strikes me at once is how conflicted we feel about this new liberty and or captivity. On the one hand, like pugs who've been lifted out of a body of water, our little limbs keep pumping on, as they did when we were hurrying off to our workplaces. Do we know how to stop? Those of us from Puritan cultures feel work must be done, and so we make the cake or start the gardening project or begin negotiation with the other writer in the house for those kid-free hours each day in which to work on something. We make banana bread, we sew dresses, we go for a run, we complete all the levels of Minecraft, we do something, then photograph that something and not infrequently put it online. Reactions are mixed, even in our own hearts. Even as we do something, we simultaneously accuse ourselves. You use this extremity as only another occasion for self-improvement, another pointless act of self-realization. But isn't it the case that everybody finds their capabilities returning to them, even if it's only the capacity to mourn what we have lost? We had delegated so much. It seems it would follow that writers, so familiar with empty time and with being alone, should manage the situation better than most. Instead of in the first week I found out how much of my old life was about hiding from life. Confronted with the problem of life served neat without distraction or adornment or superstructure, I had almost no idea what to do with it. Back in the playpen, I carved out meaning by creating artificial deprivations within time, the kind usually provided by people for people by the real limitations of their real jobs. Things like a firm place to be at 9 a.m. every morning, or a boss who tells you what to do. In the absence of these fixed elements, I'd make up hard things to do or things to abstain from, artificial limits and so on. Running is what I know. Writing is what I know. Conceiving self-implemented schedules, teaching day, reading day, writing day, repeat. What a dry, sad, small idea of a life. And how exposed it looks now that the people I love are in the same room to witness the way I do time, the way I've done it all my life. For me, the cliche is true. Only way out is through. Trying to preserve some space for yourself in the crowded domestic sphere feels like obsessively cupping your hands around thin air. You carve it out, the time you need after much anxiety and debate, and get into the separate space and look between your hands, and there it is, nothing. An empty victory. At the end of April, in a powerful essay by another writer, Tessa Moshfegh, I read this line about love. Without it, life is just doing time. I don't think she intended by this only romantic love or parental love or familial love or really any kind of love in particular. At least I read it in the Platonic sense, love with a capital L, an ideal form, an essential part of the universe like beauty or the colour red, from which all particular examples on earth take their nature. Without this element present in some form, somewhere in our lives, there really is only time, and there will always be too much of it. Busyness will not disguise its lack. Even if you're working from home every moment God gives, even if you don't have a minute to spare, still all of that time, without love, will feel empty and endless. I write because, well, the best I can say for it is it's a psychological quirk of mine, developed in response to whatever personal failings I have. But it can't ever meaningfully fill the time. There is no great difference between novels and banana bread. They are both just something to do. They are no substitute for love. The difficulties and complications of love as they exist on the other side of this wall, away from my laptop, is the task that is before me, although task is a poor word for it, for unlike writing, its terms cannot be scheduled, pre-planned or determined by me. Love is not something to do, but something to be experienced and something to go through. That must be why it frightens so many of us, and why we so often approach it indirectly. Here is this novel, made with love. Here is this banana bread, made with love. If it weren't for this habit of indirection, of course, there'd be no culture in this world and very little meaningful pleasure for any of us. Although the most powerful art, it sometimes seems to me, is an experience and a going through. It is love comprehended by, expressed and enacted through the artwork itself, and for this reason has perhaps been more frequently created by people who feel themselves to be completely alone in this world, and therefore wholly focused on the task at hand, than by those surrounded by loved ones. There needn't be anything fluffy or falsely positive about this concept of love through art. The most apparently nihilistic or anti-sentimental art has still committed itself to shaping time into something other than itself, and to the process of having that something witnessed or experienced by another person, the audience. And this, to paraphrase Kafka, is of a faith value that can never be exhausted. In the remarkable cases of Yukio Mishima and Edouard Levé, even the act of suicide, that most complete and final rejection of the idea of doing something available to us, was yet capable of being refashioned into a work of art. Such art is rare. We can't all sit cross-legged like Buddhists day and night, meditating on ultimate matters. Or I can't. But I also don't want to just do time anymore the way I used to. And yet, in my case, I can't let it go. Old habits die hard. I can't rid myself of the need to do something, to make something, to feel that this new expanse of time hasn't been wasted. Still, it's nice to have company. Watching this manic desire to make or grow or do something that now seems to be consuming everybody, I do feel comforted to discover that I'm not the only person on this earth who has no idea what life is for, nor what is to be done with all this time, aside from filling it. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to pull something out of this, this wonderful essay and turn it back to something you said a little earlier about your relations to the visual.
Yeah.
Beautiful image in the piece you've just read, where you talk about obsessively cupping your hands around thin air. And that seems to me to say something of real measure about the sense of in a way, our helplessness in relation to what we've all been living through in our different ways. And I wanted to use this as a kind of stepping off point to get you to say a little bit more about your writing about art. In recent years, you've been writing about art by artists who are, I think, quite deeply invested in narrative forms in painting. So the wonderful essay which first appeared in the New Yorker on Lynette Yadambache, for example, I use in my own teaching in the literature and visual culture paper here. But I wondered if you could say a little bit about what draws you to these artists. There's a more recent one on a Nigerian artist whose name is Odutolu, if I say that correctly.
Yeah. You know, it began out of practicality, genuinely something to do. I like to have sublime experiences. I know that's your area of expertise aesthetically. And once I had kids, my opportunities for sublime experiences in front of the larger category of art were limited, right? There was no time to read. Everything took time. It's a question of time. And one of the things I've worked out early, living downtown New York, is that a painting, one of the extraordinary things about visual arts is that its impact is instantaneous. I mean, I can take in the entirety of the art object in a moment. My considerations, my thoughts about it can extend over weeks and months. But the act of viewing doesn't occupy time in the same way as reading. I know it's a stupid thing to say, but I was so struck by it that I could have this experience of the sublime without it taking up a three-dimensional time space in my life. So that was it at first, wandering down to galleries with the children and just opening my eyes and looking and trying to do it. You know, I was living in New York where everyone is an art critic and or art expert. Where I had very good friends in that game, including Hal Foster, who's a wonderful art critic who lives around the corner. So I was very aware of being an idiot in front of the art, but I was also aware, sometimes talking to my artist friends, visual artists in New York, that there was a gap that had been expanding since the 60s between the language of artists and the language of academic art critics. And it almost got to the point of comedy, right? So a lot of when you talk to young artists at openings, they don't understand the catalogue that's been written about them. They have no comprehension of these theoretical forms that are going around, not because they're idiotic, but because the language is in some sense closed. And they were very dismissive of that language. And I thought, well, I don't dismiss it. That kind of criticism really interests me. But is there another, maybe third way to have a communication with an artist in text, given that they think very differently, they experience art very differently, they're often not particularly verbal or not particularly interested in language in that sense. How can that be bridged? So that started to interest me. And then also, so I was looking at so much diaspora art, black art. I was just curious about this narrative resurgence in diaspora art where it had been almost entirely suppressed in, downtown New York art, the kind of stuff I was normally seeing. I thought, why has narrative come back through this black aesthetic? What's that about? I started thinking about that, and also just for my own sanity, a lot of the discussion about art making in my side of the fence, in the literature side, had become to me mind-numbingly dumb. So it was about individual expression. A book was kind of you in book form. You were the final justification for that book, as if I'm a gold bullion and my book is the paper money. There was something so demented and dull in this conception of what an artist is, what it is in its relation to the book, what the relationship between a writer and the book are. And I've just found in the visual arts a far more complexity in terms of the relationship between the person who holds the brush, or in fact photographs, or in fact arranges objects, or just conceives of objects and has them arranged in front of them, compared to what was going on my side of the fence. So it became an outlet, like, to remember that there are more complex ways of thinking about artistic expression than, I poured my soul onto this page and I felt it, so it's good.
So tell me a little bit about why you reached to John Berger when you named the screen grabs in this current most recent book after Berger. There's a moment in an earlier essay on painting on the Alta Frauessee, sorry, that where you talk about how you were living in Paris. I think you were teaching for NYU on their Paris summer Paris thing, I think, and
right.
Berger was still alive and he was living in Paris at that moment, and you thought you might pay him a visit, but you didn't for some reason or other. You mentioned this in the essay, and of course he died that year, and you never met him. So how does Berger connect up with some of these thoughts that you have about you were really saying that visual artists seem to have a better purchase on certain aspects of what feeds into the moment of making art. You say that many writers don't have many useful things to say. John Berger was a painter at first, before he was a critic, but then he became, of course, an extraordinary critic of art. So why does Berger figure?
Partly it was where I was writing the book. One of the lessons I take from visual art practice is the idea of the found object. And when I'm writing, that's the way I think of books that are around me. And so I happened to be sitting in a room, not my room, a friend's room, which had an extraordinary one-room library, one of the best I've ever been in, books from all over the world, from every century. It's the kind of library I would be so proud to have. And one of the things I randomly picked up was Marcus Aurelius, and another one was photocopies by Berger, in which he has these encounters with other people. My relationship with Berger goes back a long way. I was always, an admirer I find his example a little bit, well, not a little bit, extremely intimidating. But he, we talked. I remember in Kings we used to talk about this a little bit. There aren't many examples of um, working class art, literary art in England. It's always been a minority concern or misunderstood or burglarized, and Berger was interested. So I know people often accuse him of sentimentality, his attitudes towards the common folk, and he ended up living in a rural French village, digging holes in the ground with the peasants and all the rest of it. But he's one of the few figures in English cultural life when I was growing up who seemed to have an interest in the people, in the people's experience of art, in art outside the academy, on what happens when a working man walks into a gallery and looks at a picture. He was important to my father for that reason, and a lot of when I met Jeff Dyer, 25 years ago, who was again a working class boy, made good, who got to university like me. I just didn't know that many people like that, and I certainly didn't know many writers like that. So uh, Jeff was the one who nudged me towards Berger, who's a huge admirer, and I just found in Berger, you know, a mixture of extreme aesthetic sensibility and delicacy, but also political commitment, without ever becoming. His art never became vulgar or stupid, which can happen a lot, with that kind of uh, political commitment. That can happen sometimes, but not to Berger. He managed to contain the two things simultaneously till the day he died.
Well, it's a great shame you didn't get to meet him. I think you would have really enjoyed meeting him. I did have the fortune to know him, and though I didn't know him well, but he was the most charismatic person I've ever encountered. But
Yeah, you
there's
can
an
see that
essay.
in photos.
Yeah, yeah. There are lots of Berger pieces that I really admire, but one piece in particular I'm going to use as a link to getting you to talk a little bit about why you wrote this most recent book. But the link is this: it's an essay on Henry Moore, in which it opens with a photograph of Henry Moore's hands. And in the course of that essay, he talks about how Moore was fascinated not by emotions, but by touch.
Mm.
And it seems to me that one of the things which has been most extraordinary about the time that we've been living through over these last 6 months is the realization that how important touch is to us as
Right.
humans. And I'm wondering if you might just say a little bit about whether or not that connects with the reason why you wanted to write this book of 6 essays at this moment. I mean, does the sense of not being able to touch or wanting to touch
Yes.
readers through the medium that you
Well,
have?
to make a connection, the problem with feelings, though they are highly vaulted at the moment and worshipped, is that they're so easily mediated. They're so easily mediated, manipulated. The things we say we feel turn out to be the nudge of an algorithm or the pressure of the family or the community or the group or your friends. Or feelings are unreliable, to say the least. The material things, that's what Berger was interested in, right? He stopped and looked at things that perhaps writers who consider themselves more elaborate or interesting or theoretical wouldn't bother with. He'd look at a chicken, he'd look at a cup. He was interested in the thinginess of things, the materiality of the world. And he was deeply suspicious of layers of mediation. And he didn't live to see uh, how far we could go in that direction, how many times mediated our experience could be from ourselves. And at the same time, he was always very, very aware of the tendency to sentimentalize that direct touch, in elevated naturalism or sentimentality about nature or human. All that, he was on guard against both possibilities. I admire that very much. But yeah, I missed. I like people, other people, and I'm very reliant on conversation, which is a kind of, for me, like a verbal touching. Uh, I need to talk to people, to think about ideas, to share ideas. I need to not be in, the family system only. The family system is as Berger would have probably said, a bourgeois system. It is by its nature. It tries to protect itself. It wants the best for its children. It's selfish. One of the great things about living in a city is you're not stuck in that unit. You meet others, you have encounters, some of them personal, some of them intellectual. And the moment lockdown came, that for me was the nightmare. I know that's not everybody's nightmare. Some people cozied down and was like, oh, this is nice. I don't have to go to work, or I can at least be in my home space. But for me, not to walk down the street and see, as you do in New York every day, an extraordinary young person dressed in a remarkable way, in their vibe, doing whatever, that to me is life. Like, I can't get by without it. So when I sat down to write, I realized I just wanted to recreate some of those encounters, remember people. I didn't have to know them intimately. I guess that's another gap between me and what I understand of sometimes the younger generation, that to me intimacy is not the basis of writing. Knowing somebody well, knowing somewhere well, no. Observance is looking.
So Zadie, I'm going to ask you in a moment to read a second of the essays in this new book. Before you do that, let me remind our participants, those who are listening in, that we're going to have a Q&A session after you've read this second piece. So please do send in some questions if you would like to ask Zadie anything, and then I will feed some questions to her. But before you read, Zadie, just one last thing. The reason I thought it would be really wonderful for you to read this second piece is because this extraordinary thing that we've all been living through in our different ways has coincided, I'm talking about the public health issue, has coincided with a political explosion of very, very serious, of a very serious nature. And this is the one essay in the book where you're absolutely upfront about the fact that these things coincided. So I thought it would be really wonderful for you to read this afterwards, this Contempt as a Virus essay.
Okay. Postscript, contempt as a virus. You start to think of contempt as a virus, infecting individuals first, but spreading rapidly through families, communities, peoples, power structures, nations. Less flashy than hate, more deadly. When contempt kills you, it doesn't have to be a vendetta or even entirely conscious. It can be a passing whim. It's far more common and therefore more lethal. The virus doesn't care about you. And likewise with contempt. In the eyes of contempt, you don't even truly rise to the level of a hated object. That would involve a full recognition of your existence. Before contempt, you're simply not considered as others are. You are something less than a whole person, not quite a complete citizen. Say 3/5 of the whole. You are statistical. You are worked round. You are a calculated loss. You have no recourse. You do not represent capital, and therefore you do not represent power. You're of no consequence. No well-dressed fancy lawyer will come running to the scene to defend you, carrying a slim attaché case, crying, "That's my client." You are easily jailed and easily forgotten. The stakes are low, and so contempt. In England, we were offered an infuriating but comparatively comic rendering of this virus in the form of the Prime Minister's ideas man, Dominic, whose most fundamental idea is that the categorical imperative doesn't exist. Instead, there is one rule for men like him, men with ideas, and another for the people. This is an especially British strain of the virus. Class contempt, technocratic contempt, philosopher king contempt. When you catch the British strain, you believe the people are there to be ruled. They are to be handled, played, withstood, tolerated up to a point, ridiculed behind closed doors, sentimentalized, Baudelarized, nudged, kept under surveillance, directed, used, and closely listened to, but only for the purposes of data collection, through which means you harvest the raw material required to manipulate them further. At the press conference, you could see Dominic was riddled with the virus, had been for months. Only his mouth went through the motions. His mouth said that he had driven 30 miles from Durham to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight. The rest of his face was overwhelmed with the usual symptoms visible to all: boredom, annoyance, impatience, incredulity. His eyes, refreshed by the driving test, spoke volumes. Why are you bothering me with this nonsense? Contempt. Back in February, herd immunity had been a new concept for the people, or that broad cross-section of the people who are neither epidemiologists or regular readers of the New Scientist. But for an ideas man, the phrase must have already felt profoundly familiar, being a seamless continuation of a long-held personal credo. Immunity from the herd. The officer had a sadistic version of the same face. Why are you bothering me with this bullshit? The bullshit in this case being a man explaining he couldn't breathe under the pressure of the officer's knee on his neck. A man called George. He was alerting the officer to the fact that he was about to die. You'd have to hate a man a lot to kneel on his neck till he dies, in plain view of a crowd and a camera, knowing the consequences this would likely have upon your own life. Or you'd have to be pretty certain of immunity from the herd, not an unsafe bet for a white police officer historically in America. But this was something darker, deadlier. It was the virus in its most lethal manifestation. The immediate infection comes the moment the store in question calls the cops and the voice down the line asks after the race of this master criminal who's just tried to use a phony $20 bill with the ink still wet upon it. To have any real chance of catching the virus from the answer white, you'd have to add a qualifier like homeless or on meth. The lack of capital would have to be strikingly evident, visible. But the answer black immediately carries a heavy load, and a number of potentially violent actions that would have been unlikely otherwise suddenly become psychologically possible. You don't just lecture or book this type of body or take it down to the station. It would have no respect for you if you did that. After all, it's more than used to rough treatment. Nor can it really be taken seriously when it complains of pain, as this particular type of American body is well known to be able to withstand all kinds of improbable discomforts. It lives in cramped spaces and drinks water with lead in it, and gets diabetes as a matter of course, and has all kinds of health issues that seem to be some mysterious part of its culture. It sits in jail cells without windows for years at a time, and even if it did complain, without money, without that well-dressed lawyer running to its aid, what recourse would it have? Patient zero of this particular virus stood on a slave ship 400 years ago, looking down at the sweating, bleeding, moaning mass below deck, and reverse-engineered an emotion, contempt from a situation that he, the patient himself, had created. He looked at the human beings he had chained up and noted that they seemed to be the type of people who wore chains. So unlike other people. Frighteningly unlike. Later in his cotton fields he had them whipped and then made them go back to work and thought, they can't possibly feel as we do. You can whip them and they go back to work. And having thus placed them in a category similar to the one in which we place animals, he experienced the same fear and contempt we have for animals, animals being both subject to man and a threat to him simultaneously. They have no capital, not even their labour. Anything can be done to them. They have no recourse. 3 strands in the DNA of the virus. In theory, these principles of slavery were eradicated from the laws of the land, not to mention the hearts and minds of the people, long ago. In theory. In practice, they passed like a virus through churches and schools, adverts and movies, books and political parties, courtrooms, and the prison industrial complex, and of course, police departments. Like a virus, they work invisibly within your body until you grow sick with them. I truly believe that many people are unaware that they carry the virus at all, until the very moment you find yourself phoning the cops to explain the race of the man you thought looked suspicious walking through his own neighbourhood, or who spoke back to you in Central Park, or whatever the fuck it is. One of the quirks of the virus, as James Baldwin pointed out, is that it makes the sufferer think the symptom is the cause. Why else would the carriers of this virus work so hard, even now, even in the bluest states in America, to ensure their children do not go to school with the children of these people whose lives supposedly matter? Why would they still, even now, even in the bluest states of America, only consider a neighbourhood worthy of their presence when its percentage of black residents falls low enough that they can feel confident of the impossibility of infection? This mentality looks over the fence and sees a plagued people, plagued by poverty first and foremost. If this child, formed by poverty, sits in a class with my child, who was formed by privilege, my child will suffer, my child will catch their virus. This not-so-secret terror is lodged as firmly in blue hearts as in red. It plays a central role in the spread of the contagion. To fear the contagion of poverty is reasonable. To keep voting for policies that ensure the permanent existence of an underclass is what is meant by structural racism. And it's a naive American who at this point thinks that integration, if it were ever to actually occur, would not create some initial losses on either side. A long-preserved privilege dies hard. A long-preserved isolation, even if it has been forced, is painful to emerge from. But I am talking in hypotheticals. The truth is that not enough carriers of this virus have ever been willing to risk the potential loss of any aspect of their social capital to find out what kind of America might lie on the other side of segregation. They are very happy to black out their social media for a day, to read all black books and educate themselves about black issues, as long as this education does not occur in the form of actual black children attending their actual schools. If the virus and the inequalities it creates were ever to leave us, America's extremities would fade. They wouldn't disappear. No country on earth can claim that. But some things would no longer be considered normal. There would no longer be those who are taught Latin and those who are barely taught to read. There would no longer be too many people who count their wealth in the multi-millions and too many who live hand to mouth. A space launch would not be hard followed by a riot. White college kids would not smoke weed in their dorms while their black peers caught mandatory sentences for selling it to them. America would no longer be that thrilling place of unbelievable oppositions and spectacular violence that makes more equitable countries appear so tame and uneventful in comparison. But the question has become, has America metabolized contempt? Has it lived with this virus so long that it no longer fears it? Is there a strong enough desire for a different America within America? Real change would involve a broad recognition that the fatalist, essentialist race discourse we often employ as a superficial cure for the symptoms of this virus manages, in practice, to smoothly obscure the fact that the DNA of this virus is economic at base. Therefore, it is most effectively attacked when many different members of the plague class, that is, all economically exploited people, whatever their race, act in solidarity with each other. It would involve the painful recognition that this virus infects not only individuals, but entire power structures, as any black citizen who has been pinned to the ground by a black police officer can attest. If our elected representatives have contempt for us, if the forces of so-called law and order likewise hold us in contempt, it's because they think we have no recourse and no power, except for the one force they have long assumed too splintered, too divided, and too forgotten to be of any use: the power of the people. The time has long passed when only one community's work would be required to cure what ails us. I used to think that there would one day be a vaccine, that if enough black people named the virus, explained it, demonstrated how it operates, videoed its effects, protested it peacefully, revealed how widespread it really is, how the symptoms arise, how so many to each other irresponsibly and shamefully, generation after generation, causing intolerable and unending damage both to individual bodies and to the body politic. I thought if that knowledge became as widespread as could possibly be managed or imagined, that we might finally reach some kind of herd immunity. I don't think that anymore. That's that.
Thank you, Zadie, for that very powerful contribution to developments around the world at the moment in all sorts of complicated ways. So we now have got some questions have come in, and I'll feed them to you, Zadie.
Right.
I think we've got time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. The first comes from Liz Eager, who you may have coincided with in King's, I don't know, but anyway, yeah. She asked you this: your description of contingency at the end of your book has an unexpected ring of gratitude in stark comparison to the end of the previous essay. Your writing, she says, seems to move the reader beyond contingency, and she asks you, does language turn contingency into something else? So it's a question about how you see the power of language here in relation to this this issue.
I suppose I do believe that language can transform experience. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. But it can be overstated. You know, in the case of political change, what matters to me more than anything is, I suppose, weaponized language, which I would call the law. The law is what actually changes circumstances in people's lives, not, you know, hearts and minds. I suppose my job is hearts and minds. Hearts and minds, empathy, you know, learning how to be an anti-racist or whatever it is, these kind of almost religious commitments we're making to change our souls are, to me, mostly indulgent and self-flattering. The question is, as communities, can we change laws? Can we create equitable structures that are permanent, so it really doesn't matter what kind of person you are? Your morality is not really it's not really significant. Your view of me can have no real effect on me because I'm protected by language, legal language, civic language that protects me in a broader sense from whatever you think of me. Your freedom to have crappy thoughts is absolute in my view. I'm not interested in Christ-likely changing people's hearts. I'm more interested in a language which allows us as large groups to consider, are these the structures we want to live in? Is there another way? Are there ways we can bind ourselves so our worst instincts are limited? That's the most I hope for from language. And obviously my kind of language has limited efficacy in that realm. The most important people in the world, as far as I'm concerned, are international lawyers. They hold the world in their hands. So the most I ever hope for is that the work of people like me might have some influence on the thinking of people like them. That's about as far as I go in my optimism about language.
You remind me of something, it's a dim memory, it's not a very accurate one, but of a conversation I had with you when you were an undergraduate, long time ago now. And so my memory is a little bit foggy, but it goes along the lines of something like this. It's not only that we can do things with language, but language does things to us. That
Yes.
quite reminded of a conversation we had then. And I think you just said something along the same lines. You have another question here, which is also about language, but in this case, it goes back to what you were saying about how you think about your discipline in relation to writing. It's about control. The question is, I like what you said about writing, but I wonder if losing control isn't always what happens, even as we're trying to assert control. So if you remember, it's earlier in our conversation. Yeah. So the question here is whether or not you also flip the coin and you think about the loss of control as well as the discipline you're talking about.
But that's really what I took from French theory, which I don't think is what you were trying to teach me, but I took a kind of existentialist view of it, that when I write, I have the illusion of control. I could say to myself, I wrote this book. But did I? Like, in some obvious cases, like White Teeth's an obvious case, I wrote the book. I gathered the shards together, like Orpheus. But the book is made out of books. Many, 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 many books. And some memories that are particular to me and my environment and other people. And the most you do as a writer is channel these pre-existing things. It's not as if you're inventing the language. You're not making anything out of whole cloth. The most you can hope to do is add something to this enormous tapestry. Some small thing which seems novel, but to me it's only ever novel in its recombination. It's just an unusual combination. What was unusual perhaps about that book was this history of English literature passed through this individual who had no place in that history. That was a strange thing to look at or read or see those things combined together. But that's originality it's a kind of limited thing. But that's where I see a lack of control, in that it's not mine really. It passes through me. I organize things, but I'm not inventing anything. I'm just the product of everything I've read and seen, and it comes out this way.
So Zadie, we've got around about a minute left, or just under. One last question before closing out this wonderful conversation with you. It's been such a pleasure to see and hear you. This last question is, what advice would you give to English King's students who are aspiring novelists looking to pitch their first manuscript?
I often get asked questions like this. I'm ill-equipped to answer it because the publishing side of things has remained a mystery to me largely, and I never went after a book contract. A weird thing happened. I was in King's and somebody wrote to me who'd read a short story I published in a King's thing. So that part of it was fairly passive on my part. But without being disingenuous, I genuinely think the most important thing for any young writer is to concentrate on writing. The best pitch is a quality piece of writing, a good novel. I worked very briefly when I was 15, 16 at, I think it was HarperCollins. They hired some teenagers to read manuscripts, something they do quite a lot now, but it was unusual then. Um, and I saw firsthand what, as writers, we don't often like to admit, that almost everything that comes in is beyond dreadful. It's so bad. And the people sitting there reading these things are hoping so much for a good book. I can't tell you how much they hope for it. Of course, that's, coloured by blind spots and sometimes a lack of interest in certain areas, and all these things are complicated and can be corrected with a more diverse and interesting group of people reading. But the hunger to read something good is real. And so for me, no amount of reading writers and artists yearbook guides or hunting agents down in the street or whatever it is people think will get a book published is any kind of substitute for, it's a very old-fashioned word, but making writing your vocation. That's really how I think about it. And I don't write a certain book for a certain audience or to hope that they'll publish. I just write my books. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, sometimes they sell, sometimes they don't. I just keep going. The only thing that matters to me is this shelf of books in my mind that I have to finish before I shuffle off the mortal coil. And that's all I'm focused on.
Well, thank you for that, Zadie. And it's been our luck that you've decided that your vocation is to write, and may you continue to do so
Thank
beautifully.
you. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you. I'm sorry I can't see or touch you.